One of my former bosses and good friend and mentor used to say when he was talking about our team is he used to say, we're Switzerland. We sit in the middle. We're completely neutral. We don't have an opinion about anything other than the search for, not to be too lofty about it, but the search for truth, right? We want to know what is true about our company.
I always really like to start. Yeah, where did you start off before you came into sales ops, and how did you get there? How did you get here? It's something I'm always really curious about.
Yeah, it's kind of a long and winding road. Excuse me. Well, immediately previous to sales operations, revenue operations, I was an attorney actually, and I kind of ended up there in the way a lot of at least a lot of Americans end up in law school. I don't know how it is in the UK. I don't know if people end up barristers in the same way, but a lot of people in the US, I feel like, end up attorneys because they're smart and really kind of don't know what else to do. They don't have like a real strong plan. That's kind of how I ended up. I moved to the Bay Area in 2000, right after I graduated from undergrad. And I wanted to work in tech, but 2000, as we all know, was not a very good year for tech. And so it didn't kind of really work out the first time around, and kind of bounced around, but to several different jobs. And then after a couple of years of not really finding something that kind of felt like a career, I decided to apply to law school, went to law school here in San Francisco. And then actually really enjoyed law school. It was really interesting. It was intellectually stimulating, but I did not like being a lawyer. Being an attorney was, in a whole multitude of ways. First of all, and I know this sounds like a completely obvious thing that you should know up front. It's extremely adversarial. And I don't mean, like, obviously at its core, it's adversarial, but I mean, it's adversarial in the minutia, like everything is a fight. And so that was great. I didn't really like working with, or working for attorneys. I didn't like billable hours. Frankly, there's a lot of like make work as an attorney. It was about 5% of the time I was doing stuff that was really challenging and interesting, and about 95% of the time I was doing just boring, repetitive tasks. And then on top of everything else, I just didn't really feel like it was very creative, right? It wasn't contributing anything, tangible, productive into the world. And so after about 4.5 years, I quit and decided to try to land a job in the tech space again, and did a bunch of informational interviewing and traditional interviewing, and took about maybe like 10 months to finally land somewhere. Had a ton of interviews, made it deep into the process with a bunch of different companies, but kind of hit brick walls a lot of the time when it came down to the final decision, just because I had an odd sort of candidate profile. And I ended up getting a job at a company called Blue Wolf, which was later acquired by IBM long after I left. But it was a Salesforce and sort of go-to-market technology ecosystem consulting company. So they sort of bread and butter was marketing automation in Salesforce, specifically in the sales and marketing operations space. So I landed there and kind of got my feet wet for about 1.5 years doing a bunch of consulting, and at a customer while I was there, a company called OpenDNS. OpenDNS was later, they no longer exist as a private company. They were acquired by Cisco. But their director of sales ops was my point of contact, and he left OpenDNS and went to PagerDuty. And when he went to PagerDuty, he recruited me to join him there, and kind of went from there. So that was, I think I started at Blue Wolf in 2012. That
Yeah.
kind of, that's how that that whole thing happened. Not a very traditional route, but it worked out well.
Hey, it works out well. And yeah, speaking to your point of attorneys or barristers being very intelligent people don't know what to do. It's funny, my friend yesterday started law school
Mm-hmm.
for his professional exams. He's got 3 degrees. He's probably the most intelligent person I know who's my age.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that fits him really well. So it's
Yeah.
nice to see maybe for him that yeah, it's not just an individual case in his point. One
It's
really
pretty common.
interesting thing before I moved on.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. One really interesting thing I wanted to ask you about really is you said the creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Creativity is something you weren't getting as in law, and it's something you're
Mm-hmm.
obviously looking for. I'm interested to see where you introduce creativity into your role at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word creativity, they have a very sort of, I don't know, maybe traditional view of what that means. You know, people like I bet if you asked 100 people, you know, what creativity is, you probably get some variation of response around like, oh, you know, you're like artistic, you can paint or draw, or you're a musician, or you know, you can write, whatever it is, right? Something along those lines. But you know, I think it has a little bit of a broader definition than that. You know, really, I think it's being able to take a set of information, a set of experiences, just your view of a topic or the worldview, and sort of translate that into something novel. You know, be able to translate that in a way that you know you didn't necessarily get from like a book, right? It's the ability to take information and apply it in new ways.
Yeah.
Whether it's information, you know, from your life that you're translating into a painting or a writing or a piece of writing, or in the case of operations, you know, the thing that initially was the most sort of I guess interesting and fun for me when I first started doing this stuff, and remains to be one of my favorite things about operations today, is the problem solving component. And it's interesting, the thing about problem solving in an operational space that really speaks to me is actually not that dissimilar from the aspects of law that I actually liked, right? There weren't very many, but there were a couple. And one of the things I really liked in as an attorney was writing briefs and arguing in court, right? The actual like intellectual jousting component of being a lawyer, right? So as an attorney, when you're writing a legal brief, your job is to take all of these tools that you have at your disposal. You know, those tools are legal precedent, statutory law, you know, local rules in the particular court that you're in, you know, rules of civil procedure, right? You have this whole body of different legal tools that you can draw from, and your job is in a limited amount of time and space to take all of those tools, pluck out the parts that best support your case, and then piece them together, right, in a cohesive and compelling argument. So there's a little bit of a like puzzle building component to it, except that the puzzle that you have to build is, you know, if you think about like a jigsaw puzzle, you get like 500 pieces or 1,000 pieces, and you know that those are all the pieces. You know, put all those together. Well, you know, with the law or with operations, you may have to piece together that picture of 1,000 puzzle pieces from a population of 10,000 puzzle pieces, right? You have to, not only do you have to like pluck out, not only do you have to build this picture, you actually have to find within a larger population of possible solutions or possible technologies, and develop that picture yourself. And that's the creativity aspect that I think is really interesting, is basically looking at a problem that you have, say with your sales team, and starting, say, from a data perspective and developing a hypothesis from that data around what the problem might be. And then from there, building out a comprehensive solution based on, here's a process component that I think we need to change in order to improve this aspect of what the data is telling me. And then in order to support that process, we have a bunch of technologies that we can utilize, right? We can start with our Salesforce org and build out, a solution there with some automation around it, but maybe there are things that are external to Salesforce that need to input into it. So maybe we have to build out an integration with an external system, or maybe we need to go buy a tool. Like, you were an SDR, you're probably familiar with Outreach or SalesLoft or one of those types of tools, right? Maybe we need to add one of those. So basically drawing on all of these different inputs and developing the most sort of scalable, but simple, but and simultaneously effective solution from all these different, all this different tooling. I think that's sort of the crux of where creativity gets injected into the sales operations world.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I need to send you a video of this, but it's a famous psychologist, really famous writer, who wrote on creativity. And you must have heard him, probably would have heard of him, but he essentially argued that creativity was being able to think outside of the normal structures of your mind and brain, because we all think in structures, don't we? And if you can break those structures, you can be creative in absolutely any field. Now, following on from that point, which is, by the way, a bit of an aside, apologies.
Not at all.
I am really interested in this idea of creativity, especially in SaaS. Because it's an emerging space that's always changing, and there isn't really a blueprint from company to company. So I suppose you're just thinking, like, the future of sales ops in SaaS with creativity, like, is it due a monumental change? Is it due instead actually more foundational structures being built? Where is it in SaaS? Because we know it's existed in other companies for a lot longer.
So let me see if I make sure I understand the question. So within the context of SaaS, you're saying, how do we sort of take the kind of traditional structures that are sort of, I guess, fundamental aspects of really all SaaS companies, and then apply those to the kind of specifics of how any given company does it? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I would say that is, yeah, exactly. Essentially, like, in something as fluctuating as SaaS, what do we make of sales ops and the kind of routine behaviors of sales ops leaders?
Yeah, I think, so one of the things is that, we're in this world where SaaS has become, the sort of de facto billing model in software, in the majority of software companies. Certainly there are companies that still sell, widgets and boxes and whatnot, and they're not selling SaaS, right? Because that's just not how the products they sell work. But outside of that, venture capitalists, they want to see recurring revenue, right? They want predictability, they want forecastability. So any company that can sell in a SaaS model, or can even sort of like wedge their product into a SaaS model these days, I think tries to, just because there's such a strong driving force behind that. Like I said, particularly from like an investor world, from an exit perspective, right? People want to be able to see forecastable, predictable revenue, and SaaS is the easiest way to do that. And there's a lot of companies where that works really well, right? Their product is like tailor-made for SaaS, right? Like the first tech company I worked for was PagerDuty, right? Their model is absolutely perfect for selling in a SaaS structure. Fast forward to my current company, and we do sell in generally what I would call a SaaS. Well, actually, you know what? Let me back up and disambiguate a couple things. I think you can sell SaaS and not sell it in a subscription billing model. It is possible to do that, right? You can still sell software as a service, but bill it in a non-subscription manner. So I do think that, like, you know, a lot of people consider those two things to be synonymous. They're not entirely synonymous. That being said, you know, my current company, our software delivery is a SaaS model, right? Our software is a software as a service, right? You don't own any software. There's no, like, you know, you don't download anything. You don't run anything locally on your machine, right? It's all done in the cloud, right? It's all cloud computing. And we do attempt to run our business via a subscription model, but it's extremely challenging because of the way our product works. And so we do have challenges of trying to kind of shoehorn our model into this, like, recurring revenue model. And it's interesting because we do have a recurring revenue model, but a traditional subscription model is a little bit of like a square peg in a round hole for us. And let me explain why that is. So what our product does is it allows companies that do a lot of high performance computer simulation. So like aeronautics companies, automotive companies, genomics companies, oil and gas, chip development companies, right? Like we have customers from Samsung to Nissan to a company called BioNano, which does human genome sequencing. And all of those companies have traditionally done their R&D on-prem, right? It's a huge on-prem ecosystem because you need a ton of computing power to do it. But with, you know, AWS and Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Oracle Cloud, you can now run a lot of this compute in the cloud because they have so much processing power available. So our founders were, I guess maybe 10, 12 years ago, were engineers at Boeing, and they developed the first version of our software while at Boeing because they were having compute capacity problems. And so they built it so they could utilize AWS to run all of their simulations, right? So why does that matter? The reason that matters is that all of our compute, right? We don't actually own any infrastructure. Our platform allows companies to leverage public cloud to run all this compute, right? So we have a platform that orchestrates access to whatever cloud infrastructure you want. We can run on AWS, Google Cloud, Oracle, Azure. There's several other public clouds, smaller companies, but public clouds that we can also run on. And so the net result of that is that our billing model is a consumption model, right? So we pass through the underlying infrastructure, and we charge a platform fee, right, on top of the underlying compute. And the way we do that is you give us a deposit up front. You say, I want $100,000 worth of compute, and we burn down that deposit over time, right? And so the way we shoehorn that into a subscription model is we say, well, you have a year to use this compute, right? So the contract says it's a 1-year contract, but predicting how that usage is going to go is difficult or impossible, right? Because R&D doesn't like work. It's not just like a consistent day-to-day flow. It spikes, right? Yeah. So yes, we have a subscription model, but the predictability of like when that subscription is going to come due or when they need to re-up, or when there's a possibility for an upsell, is a lot more difficult than a traditional like user-based model, for example, where they've got this many users in a year, their contract's going to be up, and then we'll see, do they need more, or maybe they need to upsell midterm, and we're going to co-term the contract, and it's super clean and simple.
Yeah, okay.
So that's a long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I think about it. So I guess the upshot is that it's really about finding the way to make that model work for the specifics of the company that you're in. Again, I think it just goes back to thinking of creative solutions, right? What is the best way for us to leverage this model for our company? And I'll tell you that there are things that we're doing internally to try to get closer to a traditional subscription model, or to get away from this like pure consumption play. And we are considering things like adding a user-based model, or adding like a just flat platform charge as a percentage of spend, to kind of make this more predictable and consistent.
Yeah, okay, Gabe, this is really interesting because earlier you mentioned how investors and venture capitalists like a traditional SaaS model because it makes revenue growth more predictable. Now, as a revenue ops person, when you're trying to deliver predictability so that Rescale can go out and get a funding round, what's the implication on you and your life and your work?
I mean, when it comes to like the specifics of, like how am I and my team involved, say in fundraising, most of the time we're a little bit behind the scenes, right? We're working with finance and the CEO and the COO to develop the metrics that they're going to have to go out into the investment space and deliver to show that we're a worthy company to invest in, right? So a lot of it is really a data-driven thing where we're pulling data from our Salesforce instance, from our marketing platform, to illustrate things like like net dollar retention and renewal rates, and average like account expansion over some period of time, and win rates, and all of those sort of like traditional SaaS metrics. We're generally involved in that respect.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's really good information. And I was just wondering if there's any extra pressures, I suppose, or if you think there are any extra pressures on the type of SaaS model someone in RevOps has.
I see.
And I suppose like the stress on their job, or if they had to have any particular ways of doing reporting, based on their SaaS model.
I don't know if there are extra pressures specifically on operations. And the reason I say that is so in a sense, I suppose you could say yes, because revenue operations is sort of the keeper of truth around go-to-market metrics. So in that respect, there is pressure to make sure the data is clean and reportable. I don't know that pressure is exacerbated by the like VC paradigm. I think that pressure is just part of the job. Like it's a fundamental component of doing your job right? If you're a revenue ops leader and you are not able to develop processes and systems that output clean, reportable data, you're failing at your job. So like fundamentally, I don't know that there's extra pressure. I think it's just a cornerstone of the job, period, full stop. In terms of like pressure in the kind of investment VC space, I don't know that there's any more pressure on ops in that area than any other department. And the reason I say that is that, any startup you're at has a cash out date, right? You have a date at which if you haven't raised more money or you haven't grown sufficiently, the company will die, right? That's every single startup there is. And so every department in the organization, right, has that pressure to make sure that they're as optimized as possible, to maximize productivity while minimizing burn. So yeah, that's how I would look at that.
Yeah, and Gabe, that makes sense, I suppose, because in your role as revenue operations, one thing you're going to be doing is lots of alignment between different revenue teams. So
That's
when
right.
you say that, it speaks to me as someone who does have that broader understanding as a company that actually bringing in revenue and providing runways is really a team sport.
Yeah, 100%. My teams have traditionally sat as sort of like a hub in the middle of basically all the departments in the company, right? As one of my my former bosses and good friend and mentor used to say, when he was talking about our team, is he used to say, we're Switzerland, right? We sit in the middle. We're completely neutral. We don't have an opinion about anything other than like the search for, not to be too lofty about it, but the search for truth, right? We want to know what is true about our company. And in doing that, I've done projects that support like literally every department in the organization, at almost every company I've been at, from sales, marketing, customer success, engineering, product, HR, finance, legal, like literally all of those departments I've done projects with, because they all have a need for go-to-market data and processes that allow them easy and accurate access to it.
That's really interesting, Gabe. So yeah, for you, the role is about a reflection of the company and what's true, and surfacing insights that really facilitate different departments. Sometimes when I speak to revenue ops people, what they get really excited about is strategy. So driving ideas and driving strategy. And I suppose what I'm interested in here is your distinction where, you're the tellers of truth, you don't have an opinion. And sometimes when I read between the lines of other revenue ops leaders, it is very much having an opinion, and it's using that data to drive where the changes they think need to be made. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on those two lines of argument.
Yeah, I'm happy to give a little more context on that. So I wouldn't say that, like when I say we're not supposed to have an opinion, I don't think that extends to vision, right? I think operations, especially an ops leader, should have an opinion on vision and company direction and strategy. When I say we shouldn't have an opinion, I mean, I guess it should better be phrased as we shouldn't have a preconceived opinion, right? About the data, right? About process. Like we shouldn't come into a situation with a rigid framework and say like, okay, like this is how things should be, and then only look for things that confirm that opinion, right, in the data. So really what I'm getting at is that ultimately operations should drive strategic conversations and strategic decision making, but we should do it in a way that starts with an unvarnished version of the truth and then works out from there. So early in my career, and I think this is true of most or all operations people, when you're early in your ops career, you're very like task focused. And that's true of any role, right? Anyone who's early in their career in any role, you're task focused, you're very like, in the weeds, and you're doing things to like execute, right? You have like a thing that you need to do as part of a larger project, and you're like executing on that thing. And so your perspective on like how to go about solving a problem, or like how to develop an opinion or a process, is very much about like the laser focus on the specific part of the problem that you're solving, right? And then, the output of that tends to be, from a data perspective, like whatever you developed has a concomitant result, right? So it's not necessarily, the point is that it's not necessarily planned, right? You do a thing, you develop a process that you think makes sense, and then whatever the data that comes out of that is what it is, right? As I've evolved in my career, I've realized that the key to solving problems effectively and developing a world where, as an ops leader, you can have a valid strategic opinion based on the data is actually turning that paradigm on its head, right? So instead of saying, okay, we have a problem, we think we have a problem, and then saying, okay, how do I solve that problem just from like a process or technology perspective? You say, okay, we think we have a problem. Let's go look at what the data says about that, right? Verify if that is legitimate based on what the data is telling us. Develop a hypothesis based on all of that. And then think about, in order to like validate this hypothesis or solve the problem that this hypothesis is articulating, what is the data that I need to get out of the solution in order to like further improve it, right? So start with the data layer, start with the reporting, and then work back to the solution, right? Say, okay, here's the data layer. What do I need to do from a process point of view in order to output the data that I need? And then what do I need to do from like a technology and people perspective in order to make this process work? So that's kind of what I mean when I say like, ops shouldn't have an opinion. What I really mean is ops shouldn't have an opinion about how to solve a problem until you have looked at the truth, truth in quotes, right? What is truth? But until you've looked at some objective perspective on what the data is telling you, and then develop a strategic opinion from there. So when you go and have those conversations, you can say, my opinion is that we should do X, Y, and Z as a company because here's what the data says. Here are the challenges we're going to have, say, from like a sales execution or a marketing execution perspective because of what the data says. And here's how I think we solve it. And here's how that informs product direction or sales strategy. So yeah, that's kind of how those two things kind of dovetail for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, what you're talking about here is almost classic science, isn't it?
That's right.
It's not true to say that scientists don't have an opinion, but what they do have is a superb methodology at which to arrive at that opinion, and they don't enter an experiment with a preconformed notion of what that might be.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Now, I just wondered from you, I mean, this is quite a broad question, so I'm really happy for you to take this how you want to, but just so some other leaders can take some really actionable insights from this interview. Like, what are your principles for excellent reporting? I mean, by that, I mean, kind of what questions do you need to answer? Like, what kind of methodology do you need to follow as a human being, as a person? Like, what kind of reports do you particularly like? So take that question however you like, but what are your general principles for having, world-class, first-class reporting in revenue ops?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think the answer to that question is magical in any way. I think I really think that like the fundamentals of how to get good reporting have been talked about and, turned over and looked at from every angle for years and years and years. And I honestly don't think you need to go a lot further than some of the traditional fundamentals, at least from like a starting point perspective, right? Like, the traditional maxim, garbage in, garbage out, right? The fundamental piece of any reporting is good data. If you don't have good data, if you don't have clean data to report on, you can just forget it. Like, there's nothing you can do to make your reporting solid if the data sucks. It'll never happen, right? So so the first thing is making sure that you get all of your systems to a place where the data is reportable. And in particular, because in ops there's multiple layers. Well, in any reporting there's multiple layers of reporting. It's like my current boss, who's our COO, we were having a conversation before our last QBR, and we were talking about, you know, how to go through all of our data and pluck out some of the insights that we wanted to look at. And he said, you know, one of the things that he always does, and I think this is a great framework for looking at reporting, is ask why twice, right? So, so really, like, you can view it as sort of 3 layers of insights, right? So you pull data, which is like, I don't know, let's say you pull data about win rates over time, right? What does our win rate look quarter over quarter? And, oh, our win rate has been dropping. Okay, so that's what the data says, right? That's the state of things, right? The win rate's been dropping. Okay, why, right? So let's look at a second layer down, right? Why is the win rate dropping? Oh, the win rate is dropping because our opportunity volume spiked, right? So it's maybe artificially down because we're closing the same number of deals, but we're operating from a much larger population of opportunities. Okay, well, why, right? So is it because we're getting a massive influx of inbound from marketing, but we haven't grown our sales team, right? So the salespeople have twice as many deals on their plate, and they're overloaded, and they can't give them all the attention they need. So we're closing the same amount of business, but, you know, our win rates are shrinking because our sales team's overloaded, just for example, right? And so to back up to the data cleanliness piece of it, though, if the data that you're basing those analyses on isn't clean, it doesn't matter. And honestly, the further down the line you get in your analysis, the worse the insights are going to get, right? Because if you think about it as like, okay, so you have a top level insight that says that our win rate is dropping. Well, if the data isn't clean, if you have crappy data, that might not even be true, right? As a first principle. So if you then ask a question of, okay, why is the win rate dropping, but it's not actually dropping? Now you've compounded the problem, right? So the fundamental thing is making sure the data is clean, and how to get there, I think, is really a matter of going back to sort of like first principles thinking, right? So a lot of times, especially when as an ops leader you come into a new company, a lot of times you'll see a lot of like historical kind of artifacts in the systems of like previous operations folks, or like maybe even stuff that's in the system from before they even had an ops team, right? When the company was small, they had engineering, they had sales, and they needed a way to track their stuff. And so their Salesforce administrator was like a salesperson who sort of knew Salesforce because that was the person who knew it best. And so a lot of it is actually starting with kind of unwinding things, right? And looking at like, okay, do we really need all these fields on our opportunity? Like, are all these things actually getting used? No? Well, that's why the data sucks, because nobody knows where to put anything and they're not getting used. So like, let's pare that down. Let's get it back to a usable state and then grow it out from there. So, I mean, from a reporting perspective, it starts with clean data. And then from there, it's, I think building it out from there is actually where some of the like art of it comes in, which is figuring out like, what is the best way to expand that data set? What's the best way to limit manual input, right? Because there is a tipping point at which if you ask your salespeople to do too many things, to input too much manual data, they'll just stop doing any of it. And so you need to err on the side of, we need to automate as much as we possibly can, and try to keep our salespeople focused on just the most important things that we cannot get in any other way than for them to manually enter them, and sort of, build it out with that kind of framework in mind.
Yeah, okay, so you're really optimizing time here. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And by the way, that example you used where there are too many opportunity stages is one I've personally dealt with often. I know exactly what you're talking about there. And I like this ask why twice framework. That's really clever. I mean, you could almost follow that into ask why as many times until you really can't ask why anymore, right?
Yeah. Yep.
It seems like a really great principle for anyone in RevOps, sales ops to take away.
Yeah, and it's
I
super
mean,
simple.
yeah, super simple. Yeah, exactly. And actually, so many people in ops that I speak to, they always say the simpler you can make any of your principles, the more effective they can be as well.
100%.
On that note of like other people and speaking to other people in ops, I just wondered, as a closing question for you, if you're in a room full of RevOps or sales ops leaders, and let's imagine just the best in the world, what would you want to ask these people?
Wow. Don't take my silence as not having a question. I think it's that I have too many questions. And
Yeah,
what's
yeah,
the like the handful of things that I would want to find out from other
yeah.
folks? I mean, honestly, I would say that the nut that I have yet to crack as an ops leader, um, and I don't mean this to say that I haven't been able to like make progress or improvements in these areas, but in terms of like being able to consistently find a way to make this work, I would want to find out like what do other ops leaders do to get the bottom 50% of their sales team on board operationally and uh, and committed to following process, committed to understanding why that helps, frankly, everyone. Like that is such a hard problem to solve, and it might be impossible to solve, right? It might
Yeah,
just be that like that, half of your sales team or some percentage of your sales team is just always going to be terrible
yeah,
at that aspect of the job. So that would be a big thing. Like if someone has, I don't think there is one, but if
mm,
someone has a magic bullet for how to make that work,
mm,
um, that would be awesome. And then another thing that I would be really interested in talking about, because it's it's probably the hardest thing that an ops leader at um, especially at a startup, has to deal with, because ops teams at startups are almost always scrappy because they just tend to be understaffed
yeah,
from a headcount perspective, and I understand why. Right? It's ultimately like it's a cost center, um,
yeah,
but like to get all of the things done that need to get done, you generally need like twice as many heads as most
yeah,
ops teams have. And so what I would
yeah,
want to find out is how do people, you know, like what aspects of the role do they prioritize? And so, for
mm,
example, one of the things that I pretty consistently do as an ops leader at startups, especially when I have small teams, is
mm,
we have to do an analysis of what is important to us as a company and us as a team in support of that company, um, around like, there's several kind of fundamental pillars, right? So um, there's completeness of solution, speed of execution, right?
mm,
There is like completeness of delivery, right? So completeness of delivery versus completeness of solution is, right, did you cover off on every single possible use case that you need to cover
yeah,
off on? Completeness of delivery is, did you deliver every component of that thing and make sure that it was 100% buttoned up and dialed in before you deployed it, right? And then there
yeah,
is completeness of documentation, right?
yeah,
So a 100% complete solution would do all of those things, right?
mm, mm,
But all of those things, given the constraints of time, are somewhat juxtaposed against one another, right? It's really, really hard to deliver a super complete solution with speed and complete documentation, right? So one of the things that ends up getting kind of like a little bit left behind, not because it's not important, but because in the stack rank of priorities, it generally tends to be the least important, is like documentation, right? Like if I'm going through with my team and building out something and we need to get stuff out the door because our sales team needs to be enabled, our marketing team needs to be enabled, documentation is really time intensive. To like really accurately and completely document a solution can take as long as it takes to actually develop the solution.
Yeah.
So a lot of times we'll either follow up with documentation later, or we'll do like, you know, sort of a pared down version of the documentation, just the like most critical pieces of it. And so I would be interested to hear how other ops leaders balance those priorities, because it's a very, very hard problem to solve.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, what you spoke of there is so true. Always understaffed and always being pulled from so many different directions. I suppose you would just like to know, you know, where can you make the biggest impact most quickly, I suppose is what you're asking.
That's right.
Yeah, I understand.